He walked into that courtroom like he owned it, because for 30 years he did. But no one told him what was waiting on the other side of those doors. If you've ever watched someone powerful enough to make judges sweat suddenly realize the room has turned against them, you know what this story is about. If you haven't, stay with us. Because what happened inside Courtroom 14 on a gray Tuesday morning didn't just end a marriage. It ended an empire. Drop a like and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning Vincent Moretti walked into the Hargrove County Courthouse, the temperature outside was 31 degrees and falling. His breath came out in small white clouds as he climbed the stone steps, flanked by two attorneys who billed a combined $900 an hour and a personal aide whose only job was to make sure Vincent's coffee stayed hot and his collar stayed straight. He didn't look at the reporters camped on the sidewalk. He didn't have to. They looked at him, the way people always looked at Vincent Moretti, which was the way you look at something you can't afford to touch. He was 54 years old, broad through the shoulders, thick at the jaw, with dark eyes that had learned somewhere along the way to give away absolutely nothing. His black suit was Italian, his watch was Swiss. The scar that ran 2 inches along his left jaw from a disagreement in 1997 was the only thing on him that hadn't been polished to a shine. He kept it because he'd earned it. He kept it because it reminded other men of what he was capable of surviving. His lead attorney, Gerald Fitch, matched his stride on the left. Gerald was 61, silver-haired, famous in 3 states for making evidence disappear and making juries lose confidence in their own memories. He'd worked for Vincent for 11 years. He had a house in the Hamptons and a daughter at Columbia, and both of those things were the direct result of his loyalty to the man walking beside him. "How long?" Vincent asked without turning his head. "Before we're done?" Gerald checked his watch out of habit, not necessity. 2 hours, maybe less. She doesn't have representation. Judge Calloway doesn't like wasting time. We present the financial disclosures, she has no rebuttal, we're out by noon. Vincent said nothing to that. He climbed the last steps and pushed through the glass door and let the warmth of the building hit him. Elena Hayes was already inside. He saw her through the crowd of courthouse staff and waiting litigants. She was standing at the far end of the lobby near the elevator, dressed in a gray wool coat that was clean but not new, holding a manila folder against her chest like it was the only thing anchoring her to the floor. She hadn't seen him yet, or she had seen him and was choosing not to react, which would have been more alarming if he'd been paying closer attention. He wasn't. He watched her for exactly 3 seconds, just long enough to take inventory. No attorney walking beside her, no paralegal carrying her materials, no associate from some firm making last-minute calls on a cell phone. Just Elena. Alone. In a coat she'd probably owned for 6 years, clutching a folder of documents that Gerald would dismantle in under 40 minutes. Vincent almost felt something that could have been called pity. He didn't let it form all the way. "She really came by herself," his aide murmured, just audible enough for Vincent to hear and not audible enough for anyone else. "She's stubborn," Vincent said. He straightened his cuffs. Always was. He walked toward the courtroom without looking at her again. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, standing in that lobby with Gerald at his side, and 11 years of legal victories behind him and 30 years of accumulated power surrounding him like a second skin, was that the manila folder Elena Hayes was holding contained exactly 4 documents, and that those 4 documents were not the documents she intended to use. They were decoys. But Vincent Moretti didn't know that yet, and for the next 40 minutes, walking through the lobby of the Hargrove County Courthouse toward Courtroom 14, he was still the most feared man in the room. He wouldn't be for long. Elena Hayes had been awake since 3 in the morning, not from fear, though fear was there. It had been her constant roommate for the better part of 3 years, ever since the marriage started coming apart at the seams and she'd begun to understand with slow, nauseating clarity exactly what kind of man she had married. Fear was familiar. She'd learned to function around it the way you learn to function around a bad knee. You adjusted your weight. You chose your steps carefully. You didn't let it show when it flared. She'd been awake at 3 because she was going over the timeline in her head for the 14th time in 6 days. Every name, every date, every document that had been quietly assembled over 18 months while Vincent's attorneys were focused on dismantling her credibility and freezing her access to joint assets and generally making her life a controlled demolition. They'd been so focused on what they could see that they hadn't thought to look for what was hidden. That was always the problem with powerful men. They assumed that anyone who appeared to have nothing was nothing. She stood in courtroom 14 at 8:47 in the morning before the gallery filled and looked at the room the way you look at a place you've had nightmares about. The ceilings were high, the wood was dark, the fluorescent light overhead had a flicker in it that the building maintenance had apparently decided to permanently ignore. The defense table was smaller than the plaintiff's table. Or maybe it just felt that way because it was hers, and she was alone at it. She set the manila folder down. She pulled out the chair. She sat. She thought about her daughter, Mara, who was 12 years old and currently sitting in a school classroom 40 minutes away, aware that something important was happening today and not being told the specifics. Elena had made that choice deliberately. Mara had already seen too much of what the last 3 years had looked like from the inside. She didn't need to see this too. Not until it was over. She thought about what over actually meant. The best version: she walked out of here with the settlement overturned, the asset freeze lifted, the financial records entered into evidence, and Vincent's legal team scrambling to respond to disclosures they hadn't anticipated. The worst version: Judge Calloway looked at the documents, decided they were insufficient, ruled in Vincent's favor on the existing motion, and she left this courthouse with nothing except the permanent legal vulnerability that came with having challenged a man who did not forget challenges. There was no middle version. There was no partial win. She had understood that going in. The gallery began to fill behind her. She heard the low murmur of conversation, reporters finding their seats, spectators who had followed the case in the local news settling in for what most of them expected to be a brief and one-sided proceeding. She didn't turn around to look at them. At 8:59, Vincent entered the courtroom. She knew the exact moment he came through the door because the room changed. Not dramatically. Not the way it changed in movies, with a hush falling and heads turning in slow unison. It was more subtle than that. A shift in the quality of the noise, a slight increase in attention, a collective and involuntary orientation toward the source of power. Vincent Moretti had walked into rooms his entire adult life and produced that effect, and he was so accustomed to it by now that he probably didn't even register it consciously. It was just the atmosphere of every room he entered. He took his seat at the plaintiff's table without looking at her. Then he looked at her. She felt it more than saw it. The weight of his attention, which had always had a particular quality to it, something between assessment and contempt. She kept her eyes on the table in front of her. She kept her hands still. She had practiced keeping her hands still. He said something to Gerald Fitch, low enough that she couldn't make it out. Gerald glanced at her and then glanced away. Whatever Vincent had said, Gerald's response was a small, tight smile. She knew what that smile meant. She'd seen it enough times in depositions and preliminary hearings, and the one disastrous mediation session 8 months ago that had ended with Vincent overturning a water glass and walking out. It was the smile of a man who believed he was about to win without effort. Let him, she thought. For right now, let him believe that. Judge Patricia Calloway entered at 9:03, took her seat with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had been doing this for 22 years and had stopped finding any of it particularly remarkable, and called the session to order. She was 63, heavy-set, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a manner that suggested she had heard every argument, every excuse, and every legal maneuver that had ever been devised by any attorney in any jurisdiction, and that her patience for theatrics was approximately zero. She was not considered a plaintiff-friendly judge. She was not considered a defense-friendly judge. She was considered a fact-friendly judge, which meant she went where the evidence led her, and she did not particularly care whose feelings got hurt along the way. Vincent's attorneys had selected her for this reason. They had the facts. Or they believed they had the facts. The distinction mattered more than they knew. We're here on the matter of Moretti versus Hayes, motion for final disposition of marital assets per the signed separation agreement of March 14th, Calloway said, not looking up from the file in front of her. Mr. Fitch, you're representing the plaintiff? Yes, Your Honor. And Miss Hayes, you're appearing pro se today? Elena stood. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked up at her over the top of her reading glasses. It wasn't a sympathetic look, and it wasn't an unsympathetic look. It was the look of a woman doing an assessment. You understand that representing yourself in a proceeding of this complexity carries significant risks? I do, Your Honor. All right. Calloway looked back at her file. Mr. Fitch, you may proceed. Gerald Fitch stood and buttoned his jacket and walked to the center of the courtroom with the measured confidence of a man who had done this 10,000 times. He was good at it. Elena had to acknowledge, privately and without any pleasure, that he was very good at it. He laid out Vincent's position in clean, declarative sentences, citing the separation agreement, the asset valuation documents, the signed disclosures from both parties. He presented the argument that Elena had already agreed under legal documentation to the terms of the asset division, and that her current challenge to those terms constituted bad faith litigation designed to extract additional compensation she was not entitled to. He was thorough. He was professional. And every word he said was built on the assumption that Elena's version of the financial history of the Moretti marriage was either incomplete or fabricated. It wasn't, but it was incomplete in ways that Gerald didn't understand yet. When Fitch finished and sat down, Calloway made a note and looked at Elena. Ms. Hayes, response? Elena stood. She was aware of the quality of silence in the room, the particular silence of people who have already decided what they're watching and are simply waiting for it to play out. She was aware of Vincent at the plaintiff's table, his posture relaxed, his expression somewhere between bored and satisfied. She was aware of the reporters in the gallery with their notebooks open. Your Honor, she said, before I begin, I'd like to note for the record that I'm filing a motion to introduce additional financial evidence not included in the original disclosure period. The room didn't exactly react, but it shifted. Gerald Fitch looked up from his notes. On what grounds? Calloway asked. On the grounds that the evidence was not available to me during the original disclosure period because its existence was deliberately concealed by the plaintiff. Now Fitch was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making an accusation without foundation? I'm not counsel, Elena said, and I'm not making an accusation. I'm making a statement of fact that I intend to support with documentation. Calloway held up one hand. Both of them stopped. Mr. Fitch, sit down. Miss Hayes, you're going to need to back that up. What documentation? Elena reached into the bag beside her chair and removed a second folder, not the manila folder she'd been carrying when Vincent saw her in the lobby, but a thicker one, dark blue, that had been sitting at the bottom of her bag since she'd packed it at 5:30 that morning. She walked it to the clerk's desk and set it down. 11 months of bank transfer records from 3 accounts not disclosed in the plaintiff's financial affidavit, she said. 2 of those accounts are registered under shell companies incorporated in Delaware in 2019. The third is registered under the name of a business that ceased operations in 2021 but continued to receive deposits through last year. The silence in the room changed quality. At the plaintiff's table, Gerald Fitch had gone very still. Vincent, beside him, had not. Vincent's eyes had moved from the blue folder on the clerk's desk to Elena's face, and something in his expression had shifted, not into fear, not yet, but into the particular focused attention of a man who has suddenly recognized that the situation requires more of him than he'd allocated. He leaned toward Gerald and said something. Gerald leaned back and said something in response. Whatever it was, it didn't make Vincent's expression relax. Your Honor, Fitch said, we haven't had the opportunity to review. You'll have the opportunity now, Calloway said. She gestured to the clerk. Make copies. Both parties get a set. She looked at Elena. You said 11 months of records. What period? January 2022 through November 2022, Your Honor, which includes the 8 months during which the plaintiff's attorneys were arguing that the marital estate had insufficient liquid assets to support the settlement terms my client. She stopped herself. Old habit, thinking of her own situation in third person, as if there was an attorney sitting here instead of her. The settlement terms I was proposing, and you're representing that these accounts were not disclosed? They were not disclosed, Your Honor. And I can demonstrate that the plaintiff had direct knowledge of and signing authority over all 3 accounts during the disclosure period. Vincent's jaw tightened. It was the first physical tell he'd produced since sitting down, and it cost him something to produce it. She could see the effort it took to bring his face back under control. She had lived with that jaw for 9 years. She knew every configuration it made. Gerald was back on his feet. Your Honor, we'd request a brief recess to examine this material before— No recess, Calloway said. She picked up her reading glasses and put them on. The court will review the documents. Both parties will sit down. They sat. Elena sat too. Her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest. Not panic, not quite, but a high sustained tension that had been there since 3 in the morning and had not eased. She pressed her palms flat against the table. She breathed. From the gallery, she heard the low undercurrent of conversation, reporters texting, spectators murmuring to each other. She didn't look back. Then the courtroom doors opened. She heard them, not the subtle traffic of someone arriving late and trying to be unobtrusive, but a definitive sound, the measured push of both doors at once, the kind of entrance made by someone who had thought about it. She heard the murmur in the gallery shift in quality, heard the whispered displacement of breath and attention as heads turned. She turned too. Isabella Moretti was 69 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, and had not been seen in public in connection with her son's affairs in over a decade. She was dressed in dark charcoal, her white hair pinned back with the particular severity of a woman who had once understood that how you looked was how you communicated. And she walked down the center aisle of Courtroom 14 with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. Every person in the gallery watched her. Elena watched her. At the plaintiff's table, Vincent had turned in his chair, and the expression on his face was one Elena had never seen before in 9 years of marriage. It was not anger, it was not contempt. It was something older and more fundamental than either of those things. It was the expression of a man who has just seen something arrive that he was certain could not arrive. A thing he'd believed was safely contained, safely managed, safely in the past. Isabella did not look at her son. She walked to the defense table. She pulled out the chair beside Elena. She sat down. The courtroom went completely silent. But for a long moment, nobody moved. The clerk had stopped moving copies. Gerald Fitch had stopped writing. Judge Calloway, who Elena had never seen produce an expression of genuine surprise, was looking at the woman who had just sat down at the defense table with something that could only be described as careful reassessment. Vincent was the first to speak. He didn't address Isabella directly. He turned to Gerald and his voice came out very low and very controlled, the voice he used when the alternative was something much louder and much worse. "What is she doing here?" he said. It wasn't a question. Gerald didn't have an answer. He was looking at Isabella with the expression of a man rapidly recalculating a position he'd believed was unassailable. "Vincent?" Isabella's voice was quiet and carried easily in the silence. She still hadn't looked at him. She was looking at the front of the courtroom. "Don't." Just those 2 words. The way she said them, not with anger, not with drama, with something much flatter and more final, made the gallery hold its collective breath. Vincent's face went through several things in rapid succession. Elena watched it happen. She had never, not once, in 9 years of marriage and 3 years of legal war, seen Vincent Moretti not know what to do with his face. He always knew. His face was one of his instruments, like his money and his lawyers, and the network of relationships built on fear and mutual interest that had sustained his power for 3 decades. His face was something he controlled. He wasn't controlling it now. "Your Honor." He stood. Gerald grabbed his arm and Vincent shook him off. "I'd like to request a brief recess." "Mr. Moretti," Calloway said, "you are not represented. Please be seated. My attorney—" "Your attorney may speak on your behalf. You may not. Sit down, Mr. Moretti." Vincent sat. The muscle in his jaw was working. Elena could see it from 6 feet away. Isabella finally turned to look at her son. The look on her face was not warm, and it was not cold. It was something in between. The expression of a woman who has spent a long time understanding something painful and has finally arrived at the point where understanding it is enough, where she doesn't need it to be different anymore. "I told you," she said quietly, just to him, "that there would be a moment when you went too far." Vincent said nothing. "This is that moment." He looked at her for a long time, then he looked away. Judge Calloway cleared her throat. "Ms. Hayes." Is this individual here with your knowledge and consent? Elena looked at Isabella. Isabella looked back at her, and for a moment the two women held a kind of eye contact that contained the compressed weight of a great many conversations held in private over the past 8 months. Phone calls made from payphones, documents exchanged through intermediaries. A single face-to-face meeting in a diner 40 miles outside of the city where Isabella had sat across from her estranged daughter-in-law and put a flash drive on the table between them and said simply, "I think it's time." "Yes, Your Honor," Elena said. "Mrs. Isabella Moretti is here as a voluntary witness for the defense. She contacted me 8 months ago and offered her cooperation." The gallery broke. Not loud, not the way a crowd breaks when something explosive happens, but a low, sustained wave of reaction, the sound of people rapidly revising their understanding of a situation they thought they'd already mapped. Reporters were writing and texting simultaneously. 3 people in the back row were on their phones. Fitch was on his feet. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." "Most interesting things are, Mr. Fitch," Calloway said. She didn't sound displeased. "Ms. Hayes, you're calling Mrs. Moretti as a witness?" "Yes, Your Honor, if the court will permit." Calloway considered for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "The court will permit. Mrs. Moretti, please approach." Isabella Moretti walked to the witness stand the way she did everything, without hurry, without performance. She was sworn in. She sat. She folded her hands in her lap. She was the kind of woman who had been beautiful in a way that was now, in her late 60s, something more durable than beauty. She had the bearing of someone who had spent decades in proximity to power without ever having direct access to it, who had been ornamental and sidelined and quietly ignored in the way that women in certain structures always were, and had spent those decades paying attention anyway. Gerald Fitch was trying to figure out how to object to her very existence in the room. He kept starting and stopping, opening his mouth and then closing it again, which was the most uncertain Elena had ever seen him, and which told her something important about how much of his strategy had depended on this not happening. "Mrs. Moretti," Elena said, standing at the defense table, "can you describe your relationship to the plaintiff in this case?" "He is my son," Isabella said. "And what is your relationship to the financial structures of the Moretti family business?" A pause. Not a hesitation. A pause, which were different things. A hesitation was about fear. A pause was about precision. "I have no formal relationship. My name appears on no documents, no accounts, no corporate filings." Another pause. "My husband, before his death, saw to that deliberately. As did my son, subsequently." Why? Because men in their position don't put the names of their wives and mothers on anything they intend to use without accountability. The gallery murmured. Calloway did not call for order. She was listening. "But you had knowledge of those structures," Elena said. "I had knowledge of everything," Isabella said simply. "I was invisible. Invisible people see a great deal." Vincent made a sound. It was barely audible. A short, controlled exhale that in any other context would have been unremarkable. In this room, at this moment, it landed like a statement. "Mrs. Moretti," Elena continued, "I'm going to show you a series of documents." She picked up copies from the defense table and brought them to the witness stand. "These are bank transfer records I introduced earlier this morning. Can you identify the nature of the accounts referenced in these documents?" Isabella put on her own reading glasses, small, wire-framed, and looked at the documents with the careful attention of someone who has read a great many financial documents in her life while pretending not to. "This account," she said, pointing to a line on the first page, "was established in 2019 to receive transfers from 3 restaurant properties on the south side. The restaurants appear on paper to be operated by a hospitality management company. That company is owned by a holding corporation registered in Delaware. My son has signing authority over the holding corporation." "How do you know that?" "Because I was present when the attorney drafted the incorporation documents. I was bringing coffee." A beat. "People bring coffee to invisible women. It has its uses." There was a sound from the gallery. Not laughter exactly, but the compressed release of tension that sometimes resembles it. One of the reporters was typing fast enough that Elena could hear the keys from where she stood. What was the purpose of these accounts? Elena asked. Fitch was on his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation. I'm not speculating, Isabella said, addressing the judge directly. I'm telling you what I was told, explicitly, in a conversation I can document. Calloway looked at Fitch. Overruled. Answer the question, Mrs. Moretti. The purpose, Isabella said, was to shelter liquid assets from the marital estate in the event that Vincent's marriage ended in litigation. These accounts were established 8 months before Vincent filed for legal separation. She set the documents down on the rail in front of her. My son is a thorough man. He planned for this outcome. The room went quiet in the particular way of a room in which something irrevocable has just been said. Elena made herself breathe evenly. She made herself stay still. What she felt in that moment was not triumph. It was too complicated for that, too mixed with everything else that had accumulated in the years that had led to this room, this morning, this moment. What she felt was closer to the feeling of a structural thing finally giving way. Not the explosion of it, but the long, low sound of something that has been under enormous pressure finally releasing. She had more questions. She asked them methodically, walking Isabella through the second and third accounts, through the specific transfers, through the dates that aligned with Vincent's legal team's claims of insufficient liquidity. Isabella answered each question the same way she'd answered the first, without drama, without evident satisfaction, with the precision of a woman who had decided to tell the truth and was doing exactly that. At the plaintiff's table, Vincent had stopped looking at his mother. He was looking at the table in front of him. His hands were visible on the tabletop, and they were very still, the stillness that cost something to maintain. Gerald Fitch objected 4 times. Calloway sustained none of them. When Elena finished her direct examination and sat down, Fitch stood for cross-examination. He tried 3 different approaches in the first 5 minutes, challenging Isabella's standing to testify to financial matters she had no formal role in, questioning her motivation for appearing for the opposing party, and suggesting that her account of events was shaped by her own complex and difficult relationship with her son. To the first, Isabella produced, from the inside pocket of her jacket, a small recorder. She set it on the rail of the witness stand. In 2021, she said, my son had a conversation with his business attorney in my kitchen. He was aware I was in the next room. He was not aware that I had been recording conversations in that kitchen for 6 years. She looked at Fitch. Would you like to hear it? The room did not stay quiet after that. The recording lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Calloway ordered the gallery to settle down twice during its playback. She ordered Gerald Fitch to sit down once. She ordered Vincent Moretti to stop speaking. He had begun to say something to Gerald in an undertone that was not an undertone anymore. And when Vincent didn't immediately comply, she said his name once, sharply, in a tone that suggested she had not asked him twice in 22 years and was not going to start now. He stopped. The recording was Vincent's voice and a second voice, his attorney at the time, a man named Carver, who had retired from practice in 2023. They were talking about the asset sheltering strategy. They were specific. They used numbers. They used account references that matched the documents Elena had filed that morning. At one point, Vincent's voice on the recording said, "If she finds an attorney willing to dig, make it expensive. I want her spending, not building." At another point, he said, "The goal is to get her to settle for the minimum before she understands what the maximum actually is." And near the end, in a tone that was almost conversational, almost bored, "She's not going to figure it out. She's not built for this." When the recording ended, the room was very quiet. Elena did not look at Vincent. She was looking at the table in front of her, at the surface of the wood, at the grain of it. She had heard the recording before. She'd listened to it 6 times in the past 8 months, memorizing it, preparing for this moment. But hearing it in this room, in this context, with Vincent 8 feet away, was different from listening to it alone. It had a different weight to it. It settled into her chest and sat there. She was not going to cry in this courtroom. She had decided that before she came in this morning, and she held it now like a thing she was carrying carefully with both hands. Fitch made a motion to exclude the recording on technical grounds. Calloway denied it. He made a second motion. She denied that one too. The expression on his face had moved from professional composure to something more effortful. The expression of a man defending a position that has lost its ground and is trying to find new footing in terrain that keeps shifting. Vincent said something to him in a low voice. Fitch shook his head. Vincent said it again. Whatever it was, Fitch's response was a single, quiet word that Elena couldn't make out, and Vincent went still in a way that was different from the stillness he'd been maintaining for the last hour. This stillness had something in it that she'd never seen in him before. It took her a moment to name it: uncertainty. She had been married to Vincent Moretti for 9 years, and she had never seen him uncertain. Angry, yes. Calculating, constantly. Contemptuous, often. But uncertain. Genuinely unsure of what was going to happen next. Genuinely without the ability to predict the outcome. That was new. She thought, good. Then she stopped thinking it because she had more work to do. Your Honor, she said, standing, I'd like to introduce one additional piece of evidence. Calloway looked at her. Go ahead. Elena reached into her bag and removed the last document. She had been thinking about this particular document for a long time. She had been thinking about it in the way you think about a thing you've been carrying too long, not with attachment, but with the exhausted relief of someone approaching the place where they can finally set it down. She brought it to the clerk's desk. This is a financial disclosure affidavit, she said, signed by Vincent Moretti on April 3rd of last year, in which he attested under penalty of perjury that the 3 accounts we have been discussing today do not exist, and that he has no signing authority over any financial instrument not previously disclosed to this court. She set it on the desk. He signed that affidavit, she said, 14 days after the conversation recorded on this device. The silence in the room was total. Then Vincent Moretti did something that Elena had not predicted, which was that he laughed. It was short. It was controlled. But it was real. An actual audible laugh. The kind that comes out when something is so far outside what you prepared for that your body produces a sound before your mind can stop it. He covered it immediately. His face went smooth again. But it had happened, and everyone in the room had heard it, and the sound of it, mirthless, involuntary, exposed, was the most human sound she had ever heard him make. Calloway's eyes moved to him. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Gerald Fitch put his pen down on the table. It was a small gesture. Elena watched it happen. The pen went down and Gerald sat back slightly in his chair, and she understood, with the particular precision that comes from paying extremely close attention to a person for a very long time, that what she was watching was a man recognizing the moment when a case is over. Not conceding, not surrendering, just recognizing. The way you recognize weather when it's already arrived. From the gallery came the sound of typing, the sound of voices very carefully suppressed, the sound of a room full of people trying to process what they were witnessing faster than they could actually process it. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of the courthouse, the city was going about its morning. Traffic was moving. People were at their desks and in their kitchens and standing in line at coffee shops, unaware that inside Courtroom 14, something was ending. An arrangement of power that had taken 30 years to build and had seemed, until this morning, essentially permanent. Elena stood at the defense table. She was alone at it, technically. She had been alone at it all morning, in the way that mattered legally and procedurally. But Isabella Moretti was in the witness stand, and the recording was in evidence, and the 3 sets of bank records and the signed perjury affidavit were on the clerk's desk, and the case was no longer the case that anyone in this room had walked in expecting. She waited. Mr. Fitch, Judge Calloway said, in the tone of a woman who has arrived at a conclusion and is verifying her math, would you like to request a continuance? Fitch looked at Vincent. Vincent looked at the table. He said something very quietly that Elena couldn't hear. Then he looked up. He looked at Elena. The expression on his face was not what she'd imagined in the long months of imagining this moment. It wasn't rage. It wasn't fear. It was something she had no word for, something that lived in the space between recognition and refusal, between understanding what has happened and not yet accepting that it cannot be undone. He looked at her for a long moment. She held it. No continuance, Fitch said quietly. Calloway nodded. She made a note. Then we'll take a 30-minute recess. When we return, the court will address the motion in light of the evidence introduced today. She looked at both tables. Both parties should be prepared for the possibility that the proceedings will continue into the afternoon. She stood. The clerk called the room to rise. Everyone rose. And as the judge walked off the bench and the gallery erupted into the noise of people releasing 30 minutes of held breath all at once, Elena Hayes sat down in her chair and put both hands flat on the table and let herself, for exactly 10 seconds, feel the full weight of the morning. Then she straightened up. She had 30 minutes. There were still things that could go wrong. Isabella was still in the witness stand, rising, rolling her neck slightly, a movement that made her suddenly look her age in a way she hadn't for the past hour. Elena would need to prepare for whatever Fitch attempted on redirect. She would need to verify that all the documents had been properly entered. She would need to be ready for whatever Vincent was going to try during the recess, because Vincent Moretti did not stop trying. That was the thing about him, the thing that made him what he was, the quality that had built the empire and would now require dismantling it. He did not accept what he could not control. He didn't know how. She began to reach for her folder. Then her phone, which she'd had on silent in her bag all morning, buzzed once, then again, then a third time in rapid succession. She looked at the screen. 3 texts. Same number. The number belonged to a man named David Carver, the attorney whose voice was on Isabella's recording, the attorney who had retired in 2023, the attorney who, as far as Elena's entire legal strategy was concerned, was a figure from the past who was no longer relevant to the present. The first text said, "I need to speak with you before court reconvenes." The second said, "There is a document I didn't know existed until this morning. Vincent has a copy. I don't know what's in it, but he made a call 30 minutes ago, and whatever he was told made him very calm. That's not a good sign." The third said, "Ms. Hayes, be careful." Elena read the texts twice. She read them a third time. The noise of the gallery was still moving around her, people standing, talking, reporters filing out to make calls. And she sat inside it and read the words on her phone and felt the 30 minutes of compressed relief drain away, replaced by something colder and more focused. Whatever had just happened in this courtroom, whatever ground she had gained, whatever she had believed in the last 30 minutes that she was close to, Vincent had been on the phone during the recess. And something he'd been told had made him calm. Vincent Moretti was never calm when he was losing. She put the phone face down on the table. She picked up her folder. Her hands were steady. Whatever was coming in 30 minutes, she was going to be ready. She told herself that. She almost believed it. The 30 minutes came and went faster than Elena had expected, which was how she knew she wasn't ready. She had tried to reach Carver. The call went to voicemail on the first attempt and to a full mailbox on the second, which meant he'd either turned his phone off or was somewhere he couldn't speak. She texted back, "What document? What did he say on the call?" She got no response. She sat with the phone face down on the table and went through her remaining documents twice, looking for the gap, the thing she'd missed, the angle she hadn't covered, the piece of the structure that Vincent had identified and was now quietly reinforcing while she sat here believing she'd already won. She didn't find it. That didn't mean it wasn't there. Isabella had come to stand behind the defense table during the recess, not sitting, standing, with her hands folded in front of her, watching the gallery the way you watch weather. She hadn't used her phone. She hadn't spoken to anyone. She'd accepted a cup of water from the clerk's aide and held it without drinking it. "He made a call," Elena said, quietly enough that only Isabella could hear. "I know." Isabella's voice was equally quiet. "I saw." "Who does he call when he needs something fast?" A pause. "There are several people. It depends on what he needs." She set the cup of water down on the table. "If it's something that can be undone legally, he calls Gerald. Gerald's already here, so it's not that." "Then what?" "If it's something that needs to arrive," Isabella said, "he calls a man named Reyes, Marcus Reyes. He was my husband's fixer before my husband died. He's been Vincent since." Elena had heard the name. It had come up once in the financial documents, in a transaction that appeared to be legitimate, a consulting fee paid through one of the shell companies, the kind of transaction that looked clean unless you knew what to look for. She'd flagged it and set it aside and focused on the more immediately useful evidence. She was rethinking that decision now. What would Reyes be bringing? Isabella looked at her. The look was careful and a little heavy, the look of someone choosing how much of what they know to release at once. When Vincent's father wanted to make a problem disappear, she said, he didn't destroy it. He relocated it. He put it somewhere he controlled, where it couldn't be used against him. A pause. Vincent learned from his father. You're telling me there's something he moved. I'm telling you it's possible. She picked the cup of water back up. I don't know what it is. If I knew, I would have told you 8 months ago. Elena absorbed that. She looked at the courtroom doors, which were still open, people filtering back in from the recess. She looked at the plaintiff's table, where Gerald Fitch was making notes on a yellow legal pad with the focused intensity of a man who has found new ground. Vincent was not at the table. She scanned the room. He wasn't in the gallery. He wasn't near the doors. Where is he? She said. Isabella turned, looked. The men's room is to the left of the main entrance, she said, but that's not where he goes when he needs to talk. 3 minutes later, Vincent came back through the courtroom doors. He walked to the plaintiff's table and sat down. He said something to Gerald, and Gerald stopped writing and looked at him. And something passed between them, a look of the kind that contained a complete conversation compressed into 2 seconds. And then Gerald put his pen down and straightened up slightly in his chair. Vincent looked across at Elena. He was calm. That was the thing Carver's text had flagged, and the thing she was now seeing in real time. The thing that lived underneath everything else, and was more alarming than anything Vincent had done in the first half of the morning. He was calm in the way he'd been calm in the early years of their marriage, before she understood what that particular calm meant. It was the calm of a man who has located his leverage. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. She couldn't afford to let the looking mean something, couldn't afford to let him know she'd registered it. She was still looking at her documents when Judge Calloway returned and called the court back to order. Before we continue, Calloway said, settling into her chair and reaching for her reading glasses, the court has had the opportunity during the recess to review the documents introduced by the defense this morning. She opened the file in front of her. Mr. Fitch, your client's financial affidavit and the bank transfer records introduced by Ms. Hayes present a significant evidentiary conflict. The court will need to address, Your Honor, Gerald Fitch stood. The plaintiff would like to introduce a counter document at this time. Calloway looked up. Excuse me? A document that was not previously entered into the record because its relevance was not apparent until this morning's testimony. He was holding a folder, not thick, maybe 4 or 5 pages. He walked it to the clerk's desk. The plaintiff is introducing a signed financial agreement dated September 9th of last year between Elena Hayes and a third-party financial advisor, which we contend demonstrates that Ms. Hayes had prior knowledge of the accounts she claims were hidden from her. Elena felt it before she understood it, a physical thing, a cold drop low in her sternum. Prior knowledge, Calloway repeated. Ms. Hayes, you've seen this document? No, Your Honor. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. I have not. The plaintiff is contending that you signed this agreement. I'm contending, Elena said, that I did not. Fitch said, the document bears Ms. Hayes' signature and is notarized. The clerk made copies. One was brought to Elena. She picked it up. She looked at it. The date was September 9th of the prior year. The document was a financial consulting agreement between Elena Hayes and a firm called Meridian Capital Advisors. It laid out, in clean legal language, a consulting arrangement under which Elena would receive advisory services related to, among other things, asset management strategy for, and here the document used language that made her stomach tighten, a portfolio of investments including the 3 accounts currently in dispute. At the bottom was a signature, her name, in cursive. Below it, a notary stamp. She read it twice. Then she looked up. This is not my signature, she said. Your Honor, Fitch began. I am aware that Mr. Fitch will dispute that, Elena said. I am telling this court that I did not sign this document. I have never had contact with Meridian Capital Advisors, and I have never been party to any financial consulting arrangement of this kind. And I'm requesting that the court order forensic examination of this signature before it is entered as evidence. Calloway looked at the document. She looked at Fitch. She looked at Elena. Mr. Fitch, when was this document obtained? It came to the plaintiff's attention this morning, Your Honor, as a result of— This morning, Calloway said, during the recess. A beat. Yes, Your Honor. The judge's expression did not change, but something in it sharpened. And you're presenting it now. The timing was circumstantial, Your Honor. The document's existence was not— I'll note the timing for the record, Calloway said. Ms. Hayes's request for forensic examination is granted. The document will not be entered as substantive evidence until that examination is complete. In the interim, she set down her reading glasses. Mr. Fitch, I want to be very clear about something. If the court finds that this document was produced or obtained through any means intended to mislead this proceeding, the consequences will extend well beyond the outcome of today's motion. Am I understood? Yes, Your Honor. Sit down. He sat. Elena set the document on the table in front of her. She was breathing carefully. Measured, deliberate, the kind of breathing you do when you are not going to let your body betray you. She looked at the signature. It was close. It was very close. The slant of the letters, the way she looped the H in Hayes, the slight pressure mark at the end of the last name where she had a habit of lifting the pen. Whoever had produced it had access to multiple samples of her handwriting. That meant records. That meant someone who had been inside the marriage, inside the documentation, for years. She thought, he planned this too. He planned all of it. Then she thought, so did I. Don't forget that. From behind her, from the gallery, she heard a low sound. Not conversation, but the tight, pressurized murmur of people who are watching something develop and can't decide yet what it's developing into. Reporters were tracking every exchange. She could feel the room's attention like a physical pressure against the back of her neck. Isabella was very still beside her. He had it made, Isabella said, barely above a breath. That's what the call was. Elena said nothing. He's had it for longer than this morning. The call was to find out if it was clean enough to use. Isabella turned the document slightly so she could read it. Her reading glasses were still in her jacket pocket, and she didn't put them on. She didn't need to. Meridian Capital, she said. Do you know what that is? No. It's the name of a company that Vincent's accountant registered in 2020. It's never had clients. It's never had operations. It's a shell with a name that sounds legitimate enough that most people don't look further. She set the document back flat. He's been holding this in reserve. If you introduce the accounts, he introduces this. You knew about the accounts because you had a consulting arrangement with the company managing them. That's the argument. It won't hold up. It doesn't need to hold up, Isabella said. It needs to create enough reasonable conflict in the evidentiary record that the judge delays ruling, orders additional discovery, and gives Vincent's team 6 months to bury the original documents in procedural challenges. Her voice was flat and informational, the voice of someone who has watched this exact mechanism operate for decades. That's always been his strategy. Not to win immediately, to exhaust the other side into giving up. Elena understood that. She understood it in a way that was not abstract. She understood it from the inside, from 3 years of watching her own resources drain away while Vincent's attorneys filed motions and requested extensions and created procedural complexity that cost money to respond to. He had been trying to exhaust her. He had nearly succeeded. She looked down at the document again. The signature. Then something occurred to her. It was small at first. A detail. She looked at the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. The circular seal, the printed name, the registration number. She looked at the date on the stamp. September 9th. She reached into her bag. She was looking for something specific. A document she had kept not because she thought it would be useful, but because she kept everything, had been keeping everything for 3 years with the particular compulsiveness of someone who has learned the hard way that you never know what will matter later. She found it. A receipt. A rideshare receipt. Time-stamped. With GPS coordinates embedded in the metadata. September 9th. She had been in her car, in transit, from her apartment in Westfield to her sister's house in Dunmore. A 2-hour drive she'd made to attend her niece's birthday dinner. The receipt showed her location, continuously, from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. The notary stamp on the forged document was time-stamped 12:17 p.m. She had been on a highway 40 miles away. She stood. Your Honor, she said, I have additional evidence relevant to the document just introduced by the plaintiff. Calloway looked at her. Go ahead. I have a time-stamped GPS-verified transportation record placing me in transit on September 9th at the time indicated by the notary stamp on this document. I was not in any location where this signing could have occurred. She walked the receipt to the clerk's desk. I'm also requesting that the court subpoena the notary whose stamp appears on this document. The notary's registration number is visible on the seal. If that notary attests to having witnessed this signature, I'd like them to do it under oath. The room reacted. Not loudly. There was a sustained, pressurized murmur from the gallery, the sound of a room recalibrating for the third time in a single morning. One of the reporters in the second row had leaned forward with both elbows on the bench in front of her, a posture that communicated the complete abandonment of professional composure in favor of watching something closely. At the plaintiff's table, Gerald Fitch had stopped moving. He was looking at Vincent. Vincent was looking at the clerk's desk, where the receipt had just been laid. His jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. He was still calm. The surface of him was still controlled, but beneath it something had shifted. Elena could see it from where she stood, because she had been looking at Vincent Moretti for 9 years, and she knew the difference between his chosen calm and his imposed calm. The first one came from confidence. The second one came from effort. This was the second one. Fitch said very quietly, something to Vincent that Elena couldn't make out. Vincent's response was a single syllable. Fitch pressed his lips together and looked at the table. The court will issue a subpoena for the notary of record, Calloway said, making a note. This complicates the timeline for today's proceedings considerably. She looked at both tables. I'm going to say something directly to both parties. We began this morning with what appeared to be a relatively straightforward motion regarding asset disposition. What we have now is a significantly more complex evidentiary situation involving potential document fraud, potential perjury, and financial concealment that may have legal implications beyond this civil proceeding. She paused. The court is going to need time to properly process what has been introduced today. However, she looked at the document on the clerk's desk, the forged agreement. However, I am not inclined to grant a delay that would benefit a party that may have introduced fraudulent evidence into these proceedings. Mr. Fitch, I'll hear your argument for continuance, if you have one. Fitch stood. He was very composed. He was a professional, and he was doing his job, but the composure required more visible maintenance now than it had at 9 o'clock that morning. Your Honor, my client disputes the characterization of the document as fraudulent and maintains that your client's characterization is noted, Calloway said. His attestation that the signature is genuine will be tested by forensic examination. In the meantime, the financial records introduced by the defense this morning remain in evidence and the court will proceed on that basis. Do you have a substantive argument for continuance? A pause. No, Your Honor. She nodded. Then we continue. Ms. Hayes, you indicated this morning that you had additional witness testimony available. Yes, Your Honor. Proceed. Elena looked down at her notes. She had one more witness. She had planned this witness for last, for the reason that last impressions in a courtroom sometimes matter more than first ones. And because this particular witness was the most dangerous card she held, not because of what they would say, but because of what their presence here would mean to Vincent, specifically on a level that had nothing to do with evidence. The defense calls Renata Cruz, she said. The gallery doors opened. The woman who walked in was 41 years old, compact, dark-haired, dressed in a black blazer over a white shirt with the careful neatness of someone who has thought about how they need to present themselves and has done everything in their power to achieve it. She walked down the aisle without looking at the gallery, without looking at the defense table, without looking at Elena. She looked at Vincent. He looked back at her. And something happened in the space between those two looks. Something that the gallery couldn't see and couldn't name but could feel, the way you feel weather through a wall before it arrives. Vincent's face did something complicated and then resolved itself back into stillness. But it took longer this time, required more visible effort, and the effort itself was a kind of answer to a question the room hadn't known it was asking. Elena had found Renata Cruz 14 months ago through a reference in a financial document that had nothing to do with finances, a property transfer, a residential address in a building Vincent had owned, and then transferred to a holding company the same month he'd filed for legal separation. Elena had tracked the transfer and then tracked the address, and what she found was a woman who had worked as a financial controller for Vincent's restaurant group for 6 years and who had left that position abruptly in 2021 with a severance agreement that included, among other things, a non-disclosure clause covering the specific accounts now in evidence. The NDA was civil. It was not criminal. It could not prevent Renata from testifying in a court proceeding if she chose to do so. She had chosen to do so. Renata took the witness stand. She was sworn in. She sat and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at Elena with the expression of a woman who has made a decision at significant personal cost and is not going to let the cost show until she's somewhere she can afford to show it. "Ms. Cruz," Elena said, "can you describe your former role within the Moretti Restaurant Group?" "Financial controller. I managed all accounts payable and receivable for the restaurant properties, coordinated with the external accounting firm, and had direct oversight of cash flow management across all operating entities." "During your time in that role, did you have occasion to work with the accounts referenced in the documents introduced earlier today?" Renata looked at the clerk's desk. "Yes." "Can you describe the nature of those accounts?" "They were receiving accounts," Renata said. Her voice was steady. "Cash deposits from the restaurant operations were split. A portion went into the legitimate operating accounts, and a portion was redirected. The redirected funds went through a transfer protocol that I was instructed to process monthly. I was told the transfers were a tax management strategy." A pause. "I understood later that they were not." "When did you understand that?" "When I was asked to alter the records." She said it flatly. "In August of 2021, I was told to amend historical transaction logs to remove the transfer protocol from the documentation. I was told it was a housekeeping measure." "Did you comply?" A silence that lasted exactly one breath. "Partially. I altered some records. I kept copies of the originals." The sound from the gallery was brief and involuntary, the audible intake of a room's collective breath. Elena kept her face neutral. She had known this was coming, had known it for 14 months. But hearing it said aloud in a courtroom, under oath, with a judge and 20 reporters and Vincent Moretti as witnesses, was different from knowing it in the abstract. "You kept the originals," Elena said. "Yes." "And those originals, do they correspond to the records introduced into evidence this morning?" "Yes, they do." Fitch was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is characterizing documents she has not been shown." "Show her the documents," Calloway said. The clerk brought copies to the stand. Renata looked through them. She turned 3 pages with the careful attention of someone reading something she already knows by heart. "Yes," she said. "These correspond to the originals I retained." "Your Honor," Elena said, "the defense would like to request that Ms. Cruz's copies be entered into evidence as corroborating documentation." "So ordered," Calloway said. At the plaintiff's table, something was happening. Gerald Fitch had leaned close to Vincent and was speaking rapidly and quietly, the urgent, compressed speech of an attorney delivering information to a client that the client does not want to hear. Vincent's response was equally compressed and equally inaudible. But his posture during it was different from any posture she had seen him hold in the past 2 hours. His shoulders had moved, slightly, fractionally, a millimeter at most. And in that millimeter was everything. Vincent Moretti did not let his shoulders move. Not in rooms like this. Not in moments like this. His body was one of his tools, and he controlled it with the same deliberate maintenance with which he controlled everything else. The millimeter meant the control was going. Elena turned back to Renata. "Ms. Cruz, you mentioned that you were asked to alter records in August of 2021. Who gave you that instruction?" Renata looked at the witness stand railing. Then she looked up. "Vincent Moretti," she said. "Directly, in a phone call. He called my personal number at 7:40 in the morning." "Did you record that call?" "No." "But you documented it." "I sent myself an email immediately after the call ended. I described the instruction in detail. I included the time, the number he called from, and the exact phrasing he used." She kept her gaze on the front of the courtroom. "He said, and I wrote this down verbatim, 'There's some paperwork that needs tidying. You know what I'm talking about. Make it clean. I wrote it down because I had already begun to understand that I might need documentation of what I was being asked to do. That email still exists? It's in the documents I provided to the defense. Elena nodded. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, that email is included in the supplementary documentation the defense filed this morning, Exhibit 14. Calloway already had the exhibit. She was reading it. She read it for a long moment, long enough for the courtroom to go quiet with the particular quality of quiet that surrounds a judge reading something important. Then she set it down. She did not immediately speak. In that silence, Vincent Moretti stood up. He didn't address the judge. He didn't address his attorney. He turned and looked at Renata Cruz in the witness stand, and the look on his face was something that Elena had seen before. Not often, but she had seen it in the worst moments of the marriage, in the moments when something had moved outside of his control and he was choosing how to respond. It was the look that preceded everything else. The look that said the calculation was complete and the result of it was going to be bad for whoever was in the room with him. Sit down, Vincent, Isabella said. She said it the same way she'd said it the first time. No drama, no elevation, the flat finality of a woman who has decided this is how things are going to be. But this time there was something else underneath it, something tired. Vincent looked at his mother. For the space of 3 or 4 seconds, the courtroom held. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The reporter in the second row had her pen pressed to her notepad and was not writing. The clerk had stopped moving entirely. Gerald Fitch was looking at the table. Then Vincent looked at Renata again. And what came out of his mouth was not a threat exactly, and not a statement exactly, and not anything you could enter into a record. It was a sound, low and controlled and entirely stripped of the social veneer that usually covered what he was. And in it was 30 years of being the person who decided what happened and what didn't happen and who got what and who got nothing. It was the sound of that structure encountering something it had never fully encountered before, which was a room that had already decided not to be afraid of it. Renata did not flinch. Elena noted that. She had been watching for it, had been, in the back of her mind since the moment Renata had walked through those courtroom doors, genuinely uncertain whether the woman would hold her composure when it came to this. Renata Cruz had spent 6 years in proximity to Vincent Moretti and had left that proximity at significant cost and had lived for 3 years under an NDA that had functioned as a kind of low-grade permanent fear. She would have had every reason to flinch. She didn't. Mr. Moretti, Judge Calloway said, sit down, now. He sat. The motion was controlled. Everything about it was controlled except the fact that he had stood in the first place, which was the only thing that mattered. Calloway let a moment pass. Then she looked at Gerald Fitch with an expression that communicated a great many things efficiently. Counselor, if your client is unable to maintain appropriate courtroom conduct, the court will consider its options. Are we clear? Yes, Your Honor. Fitch's voice was even. My apologies. Calloway turned back to the witness stand. Ms. Cruz, do you require a moment? No, Your Honor. Renata's voice was steady. Then Ms. Hayes may continue. Elena asked 2 more questions. She didn't need more than that. The substance was already in the record. The email was already in evidence. Renata's testimony had already done what it needed to do. She kept the questions procedural, confirmatory, brief. Then she said, no further questions, Your Honor, and sat down. Fitch stood for cross-examination. He had recovered his professional bearing entirely, which was its own kind of achievement given what the past 2 hours had looked like. He questioned Renata's decision to retain copies of documents she'd been instructed to amend. He questioned the completeness of the email she'd sent herself. He raised the possibility that her departure from the Moretti restaurant group had left her with a personal grievance that might color her testimony. Renata answered each question the same way she'd answered Elena's, directly, without elaboration, without visible emotion. She gave Fitch exactly as much as the question required, and nothing more. Elena watched her and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was a complex, compressed admiration for a woman she barely knew, who had carried a dangerous piece of the truth for 3 years, and had chosen, finally, to put it down in the right place. After Fitch sat down and Calloway dismissed Renata from the stand, the room moved into a brief procedural pause. Calloway reviewing the evidence log, the clerk organizing exhibits, the low administrative murmur of a court preparing to deliver something. Elena used the time to drink the water that had been sitting at her table since 9 o'clock and was now completely flat and barely cold. She drank it like she was thirsty, because she was. Isabella put a hand on the table near Elena's. Not on her hand, not touching, just near. It was the gesture of someone who has not been demonstrative in a very long time and is trying. Elena left her own hand where it was. Calloway finished reviewing. She set down her reading glasses and folded her hands on the bench in front of her. "I've heard sufficient testimony and reviewed sufficient documentary evidence to address the plaintiff's motion," she said. "Before I do, I want to place something on the record. What has been presented in this courtroom today, specifically the financial records demonstrating concealment of assets during the disclosure period, the audio recording entered into evidence, and the corroborating testimony of 2 independent witnesses, constitutes a significant body of evidence of potential fraud upon this court. I am referring this matter to the relevant authorities for investigation. That referral will occur regardless of how this motion is decided." The gallery reacted. Calloway didn't call for order. She waited for it to settle on its own, and it did, within 30 seconds. "With respect to the motion before the court," she continued, "regarding final disposition of marital assets," the doors opened. Not the gallery doors, the side door. The one that led from the courthouse corridor to the courtroom's secondary entrance. The one that bailiffs used and that nobody else used during an active proceeding. It opened, and a man in a dark suit entered, and he walked directly to the plaintiff's table, and he leaned down and put something on the table in front of Vincent. A document, single page. He set it down and straightened up and walked back out through the side door. Nobody stopped him. It happened in less than 15 seconds, and the quality of it, the quietness, the deliberateness, the complete indifference to the fact that a judge was actively speaking, was so out of register with everything else in the room that it took a full 5 seconds for Elena to process what she had just witnessed. Calloway had stopped speaking. She was looking at the side door. Her expression was controlled, but something behind her eyes was working rapidly. "Mr. Fitch," she said. "What was that?" Fitch had picked up the document and was reading it. His expression did not change. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff would like to request a brief recess." "On what grounds?" Fitch looked at Vincent. Vincent was looking at the document. He had gone very still. The stillness of a man reading something that is either going to save him or confirm that nothing will. He turned the page slightly with one finger, as if making sure what was there was actually there. Then he sat back. He was calm again. Not the imposed calm of an hour ago. The original kind. The confidence kind. The kind that had lived in him for 30 years, and that Elena had spent 3 years trying to find the edges of. He looked up. He looked across the table at her. He said quietly, almost gently, with the specific tone he'd always used when he believed a thing was already decided. "You missed one." Elena felt the cold drop again, lower this time, spreading. "Mr. Fitch," Calloway said, "grounds for the recess." Fitch stood. He picked up the single page and held it in both hands with the careful attention of someone presenting something they know is significant and wants the room to understand is significant. "Your Honor," he said, "the plaintiff has received, just now, a document that substantially affects the evidentiary picture in this proceeding. Specifically, a signed financial agreement between Elena Hayes and Marcus Reyes dated 14 months ago, which we contend demonstrates that the defense's entire presentation this morning was coordinated with a third party who has a direct financial interest in the outcome of these proceedings." Elena was on her feet. "Your Honor, a third party," Fitch continued, "who is also, we would submit, the source from whom the defense obtained the financial records introduced today. Records that were not obtained through legitimate legal channels, but through a coordinated effort involving individuals with their own exposure to the Moretti financial structures." "That is false," Elena said. Her voice came out sharp and she let it. "That document does not exist. I have never met Marcus Reyes. I have never signed anything with Marcus Reyes. The plaintiff contends otherwise," Fitch said. "The plaintiff," Elena said, has spent this entire morning introducing documents that do not exist. He produced a consulting agreement this morning with my forged signature that I've already demonstrated I could not have signed. Now he's producing another. Ms. Hayes, Calloway said. She stopped. The judge looked at her with an expression that contained something that might have been, if you were watching carefully enough, a form of understanding. Then she looked at the document in Fitch's hands. Approach, she said. Fitch brought the document to the bench. Calloway read it. She read it slowly, slower than she'd read anything else this morning, which meant something. Elena stood at the defense table and watched the judge's face and tried to read it and could not. Isabella had gone completely still beside her. Calloway finished. She set the document on the bench beside her. She took off her reading glasses. She looked out at the room. We're going to recess, she said. 90 minutes. When we return, the court will address the admissibility of both documents introduced by the plaintiff today, the consulting agreement and this most recent submission, in light of Ms. Hayes's demonstrated alibi for the first document and in light of the broader pattern the court has observed this morning. She stood. The clerk called for the room to rise. Everyone rose. Ms. Hayes, Calloway said, not as a formal address, but as a direct statement, one person to another, I'd use the 90 minutes well. Then she walked off the bench. The room broke open. Elena stood in the noise of it, the movement of bodies, the spike of voices, the rapid percussion of reporters leaving their seats. And she stood at the defense table with the document she hadn't seen in her hands, and she read it, and she felt the specific nausea of reading something that is designed to look like the truth and mostly succeeds. It was her name. It was a signature that was close, very close, the same careful reproduction as the first. It was a date 14 months ago. It referenced Marcus Reyes by full name and referenced a financial arrangement that, if true, would mean that every piece of evidence she had introduced today had been obtained through a source with his own criminal exposure and his own reasons to want Vincent dismantled. It would mean she had known. It would mean she had coordinated. It would mean the entire morning, Isabella, Renata, the bank records, the recording, could be reframed as the product of a conspiracy rather than the product of truth. She set the document down. She looked up. Vincent was being escorted out by his aide, Gerald, beside him, the two of them moving toward the side corridor with the purposeful efficiency of people who have somewhere to be and something to do in the next 90 minutes. As they reached the doorway, Vincent turned, just briefly, just a degree, and looked back at her across the emptying room. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The look said what it needed to say, which was, I'm not done. I've never been done. You found the edge of what I built, and I built it with another edge behind it, and another behind that, and you can keep finding them for as long as you want, but what you will find eventually is that there is no last edge. There is only more of what I am. The doors closed behind him. Isabella sat down. She sat heavily, in a way that showed her age in a way she hadn't allowed all morning. He has more, she said. I know, Elena said. If Marcus Reyes' name is on a document with yours, I know. A silence. There's something I didn't tell you, Isabella said. Her voice was quiet, careful. The voice of someone releasing something they've been holding. Because I wasn't certain it was relevant. Because I hoped it wasn't relevant. She looked at her hands in her lap. Marcus Reyes came to see me 4 months ago. He came to my home and he sat in my kitchen and he told me that he had documentation. He didn't tell me what kind, that could complicate your position considerably if it became necessary to use it. She looked up. He told me to encourage you to settle. Elena stared at her. And you didn't tell me. I thought I could handle Reyes separately. I thought... She stopped. The sentence didn't have a clean ending. I made a mistake. The 90 minutes were already running. Somewhere in this courthouse or in a car outside it, Vincent Moretti and Gerald Fitch were working through whatever the next move was. Marcus Reyes was somewhere, and whatever he had put his name to, he had put his name to it knowing exactly what courtroom it was going to arrive in and what it was going to do when it got there. And Carver, who still hadn't called back, whose voicemail was still full, had tried to warn her. She had 90 minutes. She picked up her phone. She looked at it. She looked at Isabella. "Who is Marcus Reyes loyal to?" she asked. Isabella was quiet for a moment. "He was loyal to my husband. After my husband died, he shifted to Vincent because Vincent was who paid him." Another pause. "But Marcus Reyes is ultimately loyal to Marcus Reyes." Elena looked at the phone in her hand. There was a number she had not called. She had found it 6 months ago and filed it away and told herself it was a last resort. The kind of last resort you hold on to precisely because you hope you'll never have to use it, because using it means things have gotten worse than you planned for. Things had gotten worse than she'd planned for. She found the number. She looked at it for the length of one controlled breath. Then she made the call, and the line rang twice, and the voice that answered was not a voice she had ever spoken to directly, but a voice she recognized immediately from a recording she had listened to in the back of her car on a Tuesday night 6 months ago, with the heat running and the windows fogged and the weight of everything she was carrying pressing down on her like a hand. "Ms. Hayes," the voice said, "I was wondering when you'd call." The courtroom was empty around her, and the 90 minutes were running, and somewhere on the other side of a courthouse wall, Vincent Moretti was building the next wall, and she was already starting to climb it. The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to a woman named Diane Okafor. Elena had found her name the same way she'd found most of the pieces of this case, not through attorneys or investigators, but through documents that led to other documents that led, eventually, to a name attached to a transaction that shouldn't have existed. Diane Okafor was 47 years old and had spent 11 years as a senior compliance officer at Hargrove National Bank before leaving that position in 2020, under circumstances that the bank's official communications described as a mutual decision, and that Diane, in the single recorded interview she'd given to a financial trade publication afterward, described as something else entirely. She was now a private financial forensics consultant. She worked with exactly 3 clients at a time. She did not advertise. Elena had reached her through a reference chain that had taken 4 months to build. "I'm going to tell you what I have," Elena said. She was still in the courtroom, standing at the defense table, speaking quietly enough that her voice didn't carry. The gallery was mostly empty now. A few stragglers, a courthouse staffer stacking chairs in the back row. "And then I need you to tell me if it's enough." "Talk," Diane said. Elena talked. She laid it out in the compressed, sequential way she'd been rehearsing for months. The accounts, the shell companies, the recording, Renata's testimony, Isabella's position, the 2 forged documents Vincent had introduced, the name Marcus Reyes, and Carver's warning text that she still hadn't been able to follow up on. She talked for 6 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Diane was quiet for 4 seconds. "Reyes," she said. "You said Marcus Reyes?" "Yes." "And you have a document in front of you with your name on it and his name on it?" "Yes." Another pause. "Ms. Hayes, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer it the same way." A breath on the line, controlled. "Did you, at any point in the past 18 months, have any contact with Marcus Reyes? Not through an attorney, not through an intermediary. Direct contact. Any kind." "No," Elena said. "I've never spoken to him. I didn't know his name until 8 months ago when Isabella mentioned it." Silence. "Diane," Elena said, "what is it?" "I know about Reyes," Diane said. "Not personally, professionally. He came up in a compliance review I was part of in 2019. His name was attached to a series of transactions that moved through 3 banks in a 6-week period. I flagged it. The flag was removed. That was one of the reasons I'm no longer in compliance work." A pause. "What I know about Marcus Reyes is that he doesn't sign documents. He spent 20 years in proximity to Vincent Moretti's operation, and in that time, he has never put his name on anything that could be connected to those operations." She stopped. "So a document that has his name and your name on it, arriving in a courtroom during an active proceeding, is manufactured," Elena said. "Is either manufactured," Diane said, "or it's something Reyes produced voluntarily because someone offered him something significant enough to make him break the one rule he has operated by for 20 years. Another pause. "And I don't know which one is worse for you." Elena put one hand flat on the defense table. She pressed down on the wood. Can you get here? I'm 40 minutes out. But Ms. Hayes, I'm a forensic consultant. I'm not an attorney. There are things I can do in this building and things I can't. I know what you can do, Elena said. Can you get here in 40 minutes? Yes? Then get here. She ended the call. She looked up. Isabella was watching her from the chair beside the defense table, hands still in her lap, her face arranged in the careful neutrality of a woman processing something she hasn't fully processed yet. The admission she'd made, Reyes came to my home, I thought I could handle it. I made a mistake, was sitting between them in the air of the empty courtroom, and Elena was not going to address it now because now was not the time. But she was also not going to pretend it hadn't happened. 4 months ago, Elena said. He came to you 4 months ago and you said nothing. Yes. Why did you think you could handle Reyes separately? Isabella's jaw moved. Not speaking, something internal, the physical sign of a thought being weighed before release. Because I have handled Reyes before, she said finally. 20 years ago, when my husband was alive, there was a situation involving Reyes and a man in our organization that could have become very serious. I managed it, quietly, without involving Vincent or his father. She looked at her hands. I believed I still had that capacity. What happened when you tried? He listened to me, Isabella said. He was respectful. He told me he understood my position and that he would think about what I'd said. She paused, and then 4 months later, he produced a document with your name on it. So he used the meeting, Elena said. He used it to find out how much you knew and what you were protecting. Isabella said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Elena picked up her bag. She had 82 minutes left. I need a room, she said. Not the courtroom, somewhere with a table and a door that closes. Isabella stood. I know the building, she said. Come. And the room was a witness prep room on the second floor, small and fluorescent, and furnished with a table that had seen better decades and 4 chairs that didn't match. Elena spread her documents across the table and stood over them and went through everything she had, again, with the particular focus of someone looking not for what is there, but for what is missing. The gap she was looking for was the gap between what she knew and what the forged documents implied. The first document, the September 9th consulting agreement, she had already countered with the GPS receipt. That counter was solid. The forensic examination would confirm it. That document was not going to hold. The second document was different. The Reyes agreement. She had no alibi for it because she didn't know the date on it. She hadn't had time to look, hadn't thought to photograph it before Fitch took it back to the plaintiff's table. She knew the document existed. She knew her name was on it. She didn't know when it was dated. That was a problem. She called Carver again. Voicemail. She texted, I need to know the date on the Reyes document. Did he tell you the date? She stared at the phone for 30 seconds. No response. She called the one person she hadn't called yet, which was her sister. Donna picked up on the second ring, and Elena said, September 9th of last year. What time did I arrive at your house? A pause. Why? Just tell me. 1:15, maybe 1:20. You were late. Mara was already... She stopped. Elena, what's happening? I need you to be available by phone for the rest of the afternoon. If the court calls you, you answer. If anyone asks what time I arrived for the birthday dinner, you tell them exactly what you just told me. Don't add anything. Don't speculate. Just the time and that I was there. You're scaring me. I know. I'll call you tonight. She ended the call. She had countered the first document. She had a path to countering it in the record. The second document was still open. She went back to the table and picked up the Reyes file. The materials she had on Marcus Reyes assembled over 8 months, which had always felt like peripheral intelligence, background on a figure who was relevant to the broader picture of Vincent's operations, but not directly relevant to the specific legal argument she was making. She read through it now with different eyes. Marcus Reyes, born 1964. No criminal record, which was itself a fact given the company he kept. A man who had operated for 2 decades inside one of the most scrutinized criminal organizations on the East Coast without leaving a documentable trace. Carver had said, whatever he was told made him calm. Renata had said, without knowing she was saying it, there are things I don't know about. There were things Elena didn't know about. She was still reading when the door opened. She looked up, expecting Isabella, who had gone to get coffee, or possibly the courthouse aide who had stuck his head in 20 minutes ago to verify she had authorization to use the room. It was neither of those people. It was a man she had never seen before. Late 40s, medium build, wearing a gray overcoat over a dark suit. He had the look of someone who works in buildings like this. Not an attorney, not a cop, something in between, something institutional. He held the door open behind him and looked at her with an expression of careful assessment. Ms. Hayes, he said. She didn't answer. She pulled her phone from the table and held it. My name is Feldman, he said. I work with the state attorney's office, Financial Crimes Division. He reached into his inside pocket and produced a badge, held it out at a distance that allowed her to see it without approaching him. I've been monitoring the Moretti financial case for 14 months. I need 5 minutes. She looked at the badge. She looked at him. You have identification beyond the badge? He produced a business card and set it on the table. She didn't pick it up yet. How did you know I was in this room? Your witness, Renata Cruz. She contacted our office 8 months ago, separately from her contact with you. We've been coordinating with her since. He paused. We were not coordinating with you because we didn't know about you until this morning. Elena felt the room shift slightly under her feet. Not physically. She was standing still. She was perfectly steady. But the room shifted in the way it shifts when you discover that a thing you thought was happening in isolation has been happening in parallel to something else, something larger, something that has its own shape and its own logic that you haven't been factoring into yours. Renata didn't tell me, she said. She didn't tell you because we asked her not to. At that point, we didn't know if your legal challenge was legitimate or a misdirection. We needed to verify your position independently before trusting me. He paused. Yes. She picked up the business card. It was real. The number on it was a real state attorney's office number. She'd called that office before, during a preliminary research phase, and she recognized the exchange. What do you want? She said. The Reyes document, Feldman said. The one introduced this morning. I don't have it. Plaintiff's table has it. I know. I saw the proceeding. He moved to the table, not sitting, standing at the end. Ms. Hayes, that document is not a forgery. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Marcus Reyes, Feldman said, signed that agreement 14 months ago. He signed it because 14 months ago, he made a proffer agreement with our office, a cooperation agreement, in exchange for partial immunity from prosecution related to his role in the Moretti organization. He paused. Part of that proffer involved producing a financial document that could be used, if necessary, to complicate any independent legal challenge to Vincent Moretti's assets. A document that would create evidentiary confusion sufficient to delay proceedings. Elena stared at him. Reyes is cooperating with the state attorney's office. Was cooperating, past tense. He provided selective cooperation that served his own interests and withheld material information about the full extent of the asset sheltering. When we discovered the scope of what he'd withheld, we moved to terminate the proffer. Feldman's voice was measured and direct, the voice of someone reporting facts in the exact sequence they occurred. The termination happened 6 weeks ago. In the intervening period between the proffer agreement and the termination, he produced that document with your name on it. My name on it is forged, Elena said. Ms. Hayes. He looked at her steadily. Your name on that document is not forged. We have the original. We have Reyes's deposition in which he describes a meeting with you at a location in... I have never met Marcus Reyes, she said, each word separated, clear. I have never had any contact with that man. Whatever he told you, whatever document he produced, it is fabricated. I don't care how clean the signature looks. I don't care how detailed his deposition is. It did not happen. Feldman looked at her for a long moment. You understand what I'm telling you, he said. If that document stands and Reyes testifies under the proffer agreement that the meeting occurred, which he may still choose to do, depending on how Vincent's team approaches his exposure after today, it won't stand, she said, Ms. Hayes, it won't stand, she said again, because I know where I was on whatever date that document is from. I know exactly where I was every day for the past 18 months because I have been documenting my life with the specificity of someone who knew she was going to need to defend every minute of it in a room exactly like this one. She felt her voice thinning and brought it back under control. Tell me the date on the document. He looked at her. Then he said, March 3rd of last year. March 3rd. She went backward in her head rapidly. March 3rd. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, going through the calendar she had kept on her phone, the one with time-stamped entries for every location she'd been in for 18 months. March 3rd. She had been at the family court building in Westfield, filing documents related to the temporary custody modification hearing. She had been there from 9 in the morning until past 2 in the afternoon. She had signed the clerk's log. She had spoken to the clerk on record. She had submitted documents that were time-stamped. She opened her eyes. I was at the family court building in Westfield on March 3rd, she said, from 9 until at least 2. The clerk's log will have my signature. The submitted documents are time-stamped. Feldman looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, but she was watching for it, and she saw it. The careful assessment that had been there since he walked in had moved slightly. Not toward belief, not entirely, but away from certainty in the other direction. Can you prove that? He said. I can prove it in less time than we've been standing here, she said. She picked up her phone. She pulled up the document archive she'd been maintaining for 18 months on a cloud storage account. Folder by folder, date by date, the digital record of a woman who had decided 3 years ago that documentation was the only weapon she had access to that Vincent couldn't take away. She found March 3rd. She found the time-stamped file submission confirmation from the Westfield Family Court digital filing system. She turned the phone screen toward Feldman. He looked at it. He looked for a long time. That's the submission confirmation, she said. 2:14 p.m. I was standing at the clerk's window when that went through. She pulled up the next file, a photograph she had taken of the clerk's log, her own signature in the book, time-stamped by the phone's camera metadata. And that. He straightened up. He reached into his coat pocket and produced his own phone. He made a call. Short, 3 words, just, I need verification. Then he gave the Westfield family court address and the date and ended the call. 10 minutes, he said. I have 60, she said. He nodded. He pulled out a chair and sat down, and Elena stood across the table from him, and the two of them waited in the fluorescent quiet of a witness prep room that smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, while somewhere in the building, Vincent Moretti and Gerald Fitch were working through the next set of moves. Feldman's phone rang at 8 minutes. He answered, listened, said 2 words, ended the call. He set the phone on the table. The clerk's log confirms your signature on March 3rd, he said. Filing timestamp confirmed. Elena breathed. The Reyes document is false, Feldman said. It was not a question. The Reyes document is false, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document spread across the table in front of her, the accumulated material of 18 months, the physical evidence of what she'd been doing while Vincent's attorneys had been focused on dismantling her credibility. You built this alone, he said. Mostly. Isabella Moretti came to you. She did. But everything before that, yes. He sat with that for a moment. Ms. Hayes, I need to tell you something about where the state attorney's office is in this investigation, because it affects what happens in that courtroom in the next hour. He leaned forward slightly. We have been building a criminal case against Vincent Moretti for 22 months. What you have done this morning, the financial records, the recording, the corroborating witnesses, has accelerated our timeline significantly. What you don't know is that we have our own evidence that overlaps with yours, evidence that we have not been able to introduce into the civil proceeding because we have not been able to do so without compromising the criminal investigation. She looked at him steadily. What kind of evidence? A complete set of transfer records, he said, covering not 3 accounts but 7. Going back not to 2019 but to 2014. He paused. And testimony from a former associate of Vincent Moretti, who has been in protective custody for 9 months, and who can speak to the origin and purpose of every account in that set. The room went very quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because the criminal case depends in part on the civil record," Feldman said. "If Judge Calloway rules in your favor today, and based on what I observed in that courtroom this morning, she is inclined to, the civil record becomes part of the foundation the criminal case is built on. Your evidence and ours are going to be connected in the public record." He met her eyes. "I need you to know that what you are about to walk back into that courtroom and finish is not just about your settlement. It is about whether Vincent Moretti faces criminal charges or whether he finds a way to delay and complicate long enough that evidence becomes compromised and witnesses reconsider." Elena absorbed that. She turned it over. She was thinking very carefully about what he was not saying, what the state attorney's office wanted from her specifically in the next 60 minutes. "You want me to go back in there and close it," she said. "You don't want a continuance. You don't want more delay. You want Calloway to rule today." "Yes." "And the Reyes document." "We can produce the verification of your family court appearance to the court," he said. "As an officer of the court, I can submit the verification directly with the state attorney's office as the source. It removes the document from the evidentiary record before Calloway has to rule on it." "That moves fast," she said. "It moves fast because it's true," Feldman said. "True things move fast in courtrooms when someone who isn't afraid of the opposing party presents them." She looked at him. She thought about the past 3 years. She thought about the nights she had sat at her kitchen table in the apartment she'd moved into with 2 suitcases and a box of Mara's drawings, reading documents until 2 in the morning, building the architecture of a case that no attorney had agreed to take because the opposing party was Vincent Moretti, and no one in the local bar association wanted that on their client list. She thought about what it had cost, money she hadn't had, time she'd stolen from sleep, the specific particular loneliness of fighting a thing that large completely alone. She had not done it alone. Isabella had come. Renata had come. Diane Okafor was 40 minutes out, and now this man from the state attorney's office was sitting across from her in a witness prep room telling her he had 7 accounts going back to 2014. She thought, "I was so focused on not trusting anyone that I almost didn't build enough of what I needed." She thought, "But I built enough." "Do it," she said. "Submit the verification." Feldman nodded. He stood. He was already composing something on his phone as he rose. "I'll have it to the clerk before the recess ends." He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, turned back. "Ms. Hayes, the document Reyes signed, the false agreement. You understand that Reyes produced it knowing it would be used against you?" "Yes." "He's not a stupid man. He would have known it could be disproved." She had been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about it since Feldman first told her the document wasn't a forgery, that Reyes had actually signed it, that his signature was real. "He didn't produce it to win," she said. "He produced it to slow me down, to give Vincent enough delay to work with. Even if it gets disproved, every hour it stays in the record is an hour Vincent's team has to find another angle." "Yes," Feldman said, that's right. Which means the question is whether we can get Calloway to rule before they find one. Which is why I'm submitting the verification in the next 20 minutes. He opened the door. "Good luck in there, Ms. Hayes." He left. Elena stood in the empty room. She looked at the documents on the table. She started gathering them methodically in the order she would need them. Her hands were steady. The cold thing in her chest was still there. The fear, the compressed awareness of everything that could still go wrong. But it had moved. It was there, but it was behind her now instead of in front of her, and she was moving in the direction she needed to move. The door opened again. Isabella came in with 2 paper cups of coffee and stopped when she saw Elena's face. "What happened?" she said. Elena told her. She told her quickly and completely, the way she'd gotten used to delivering information in the past 3 years. No preamble, no softening, just the facts in sequence. Feldman, the state attorney's office, the 7 accounts, Renata's parallel contact, the Reyes document, the family court alibi, the verification. Isabella stood with the 2 coffee cups and listened without interrupting. When Elena finished, Isabella set both cups down on the table. She was quiet for a moment. Renata contacted them separately, she said. Yes. Without telling you. Without telling me. Apparently on advice from Feldman's office 8 months ago. Isabella was quiet again. She's been carrying 2 sets of stakes, she said. The testimony she gave today and the parallel cooperation with the criminal investigation. All without. She stopped. All without telling me, Elena said. Which means if something had gone wrong in there this morning, if Calloway had been hostile, if the documents hadn't held up, if Fitch had found a procedural mechanism to exclude the financial records, Renata had a second option available that I didn't know about. A failsafe, Isabella said. A failsafe that wasn't mine. Elena picked up one of the coffee cups. She drank from it without tasting it. Renata made the right call. Feldman's right. I wasn't coordinating with them. They couldn't trust my position until this morning. She protected both tracks simultaneously. She set the cup down. I'm not angry about it. Are you certain? Isabella asked. There was something careful in the question of a woman who has spent a long time watching the difference between what people say they feel and what they actually feel. Elena thought about it honestly. No, she said, but the anger isn't useful right now. Isabella almost smiled. It didn't fully form, but it moved in that direction. You sound like someone who's been doing this a very long time. 3 years is a long time, Elena said. She picked up her bag. She checked the time. 37 minutes left. I need to get back to the courtroom. There's something else, Isabella said. Elena stopped. Isabella picked up her own coffee cup. She held it in both hands and looked at the table. When you go back in there, she said, Gerald Fitch is going to have one more move. I know him. I have watched him for 11 years. He always holds one thing back. He doesn't use everything in the first round because he doesn't need to. He uses what's necessary, and he keeps the rest for when it matters. What is it? Elena said. I don't know specifically, but I know the category. She looked up. It will be something personal. Not financial, not procedural. Gerald saves the personal things for when everything else has been neutralized, because personal things don't require documents. They require only a credible witness willing to say something damaging in a courtroom. Elena's mind moved quickly through the people who could be called as witnesses for Vincent's side, people who had been inside the marriage, inside the household, who might be credible to a judge even with the weight of this morning's evidence against them. Her mind landed on a name. Carol Weston, she said. It came out flat. Isabella looked at her. Who is that? Our former housekeeper. She was with us for 4 years. She left 6 months before I filed for separation. I never fully understood why she left. She was thinking back, going through the specific texture of Carol Weston's last weeks in the house, the subtle change in her manner, the way she had started avoiding direct eye contact. Vincent talked to her, she said. In the last months before I filed, he talked to her. I saw them once, in the kitchen. The door was mostly closed. She was nodding and he was speaking quietly, and when I came in, they both stopped. You didn't think about it at the time, Isabella said. I had other things to think about at the time. Isabella nodded slowly. If she was prepared, she said, if he spent those months preparing her, then she'll say I was unstable, that I was volatile, that I was a difficult employer and possibly a difficult mother. Elena said it flatly, without flinching, because she needed to say it and hear how it sounded and know that she could stand in a courtroom and respond to it. That will be the argument. That the woman making these financial claims is not a reliable narrator of her own experience. Can you counter it? I can counter the financial argument independently of my credibility as a narrator. The documents speak without me. She picked up her bag. But if he puts Carol on the stand and she says what I think she's going to say, the jury, there's no jury, but the gallery, the reporters, the public record, will have that picture of me alongside everything else. She moved toward the door. It won't change the ruling, but it will change how the ruling is reported. Isabella followed her. Elena. She stopped at the door. My son, Isabella said. Her voice was quiet and entirely stripped of any attempt at softening. He is what he is. I raised him in a household where what he became was the expected outcome, and I have spent many years refusing to acknowledge my part in that. I'm acknowledging it now." She paused. "Whatever happens in that courtroom in the next half hour, whatever Gerald puts in front of the judge, whatever Vincent does, you have already won the part that matters." Elena looked at her. "What part is that?" "The part where you made him show everything," Isabella said. "He has no more walls. He used them all this morning because you made him." Something in her face was very old and very clear. "That's all I wanted you to know." Elena held that for a moment. Then she opened the door. They walked back down the corridor toward Courtroom 14, and the fluorescent lights were the same quality they'd been all morning, cold and slightly too bright, and the sound of the building came back around her. The footsteps, the distant murmur of other proceedings in other rooms, the institutional hum of a place that processed human conflict at a volume and a pace that left no room for sentiment. She pushed through the courtroom doors. Vincent was already at the plaintiff's table. He was looking at the door when she came in. He had been watching for her. She registered that without reacting to it, the specific quality of his attention as she entered, the way it tracked her from the door to the defense table, the way it stayed on her as she set her bag down and pulled out her chair. Gerald Fitch was beside him, and beside Gerald was a woman Elena hadn't seen before. Young, dark suit, a paralegal or junior associate, holding a manila envelope against her chest with both hands and looking at the floor. Elena sat. She organized her materials. She did not look at Vincent. From the gallery, she heard the room filling again. Reporters back in their seats, spectators returning from wherever they'd gone during the recess, the ambient noise of an audience reconvening. She heard someone near the back saying Vincent's name in a low voice, and the response was inaudible. And then the room settled into the particular held breath quality it had held all morning. The clerk called the room to order. Judge Calloway entered. She took her seat. She looked at both tables. She looked specifically at a document on the corner of her bench, something that had arrived during the recess, that the clerk had placed there that bore the state attorney's office letterhead. She read it without picking it up, her eyes moving over it while the room waited. Then she looked at the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "the court has received from the state attorney's office a verification document placing Ms. Hayes at the Westfield Family Court Building on March 3rd of last year. The date of the agreement you introduced at the close of the morning session. The verification includes a signed clerk's log and time-stamped filing confirmation." She paused. "Do you wish to respond?" Fitch stood. He was very smooth. He was a professional under extreme conditions, and he was performing at the limit of that professionalism. "Your Honor, the plaintiff acknowledges the verification and withdraws the document introduced at the close of the morning session." The gallery reacted. Calloway let it settle. "The document is withdrawn from the record." She made a note. "In light of the evidence presented this morning, the financial records, the audio recording, the corroborating witness testimony, and the failed attempts to introduce counter-evidence, the court is prepared to rule on the original motion." She looked at her notes. "Before I do, is there anything further from either party?" Fitch said, "Yes, Your Honor. The plaintiff would like to call one additional witness." The room stilled. Elena did not move. "On what matter?" Calloway said. "Character and credibility, Your Honor. Given the significant personal allegations made against the plaintiff today, we believe the court should hear from an individual with direct knowledge of the defendant's conduct during the marriage." Calloway looked at Elena. "Ms. Hayes?" Elena stood. She was breathing carefully. She was thinking about what Isabella had said. He always holds one thing back. And she was thinking about Carol Weston, and she was thinking about what the next 5 minutes were going to require of her, specifically in terms of what she was going to have to sit still through and not react to. "I have no objection, Your Honor," she said. "I'm prepared to respond to whatever is introduced." Calloway nodded. "Call your witness, Mr. Fitch." Fitch turned toward the gallery. "The plaintiff calls Mara Hayes." Elena stopped breathing. The gallery doors opened and her daughter walked in, 12 years old, in her school clothes, with the expression on her face of a child who has been told something by an adult she trusted and has been brought to a place she doesn't fully understand to say it in front of people she doesn't know. And Elena felt the bottom of the room give way completely beneath her. Elena moved before she was aware of having decided to move. She was on her feet, and she was at the bar dividing the gallery from the courtroom floor, and her hand was on the railing, and she was looking at her daughter walking down the center aisle with the particular careful walk of a child trying very hard to look like she knows what she's doing, and every cell in Elena's body was pulling in the same direction, which was toward Mara, and every trained instinct she had built over 3 years of legal preparation was holding her back from crossing the bar, because crossing the bar without the judge's permission would end things in a way she couldn't recover from. She held the railing. She held it hard enough that her knuckles went pale. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice came out controlled. She was proud of that. She did not know how it came out controlled. "My daughter is a minor. She is 12 years old. The plaintiff has not notified me that she was being called as a witness, and I have not consented to her testimony." Calloway was already looking at Fitch. "Counselor, did you provide notice of this witness?" "Your Honor, the witness was identified as potentially relevant during the recess." Given the time constraints, Calloway said, in a tone that had no warmth in it whatsoever. "You pulled a 12-year-old child out of school during a recess without providing notice to the opposing party. The plaintiff's position is that—" "Sit down, Mr. Fitch." He sat. Calloway looked at Mara, who had stopped in the middle of the aisle and was now standing very still, looking at her mother at the bar with an expression that Elena recognized. The expression Mara wore when she was frightened and was trying not to show it, which looked on her face exactly like the expression Elena wore when she was frightened and was trying not to show it. They had the same face. People had always said so. "Young lady," Calloway said, and her voice changed. Not soft exactly, but different, the voice of someone who has remembered that there is a child in the room. "What's your name?" "Mara," she said. Her voice was small but steady. "Mara Hayes." "Mara, do you know why you're here today?" A pause. Mara looked at her mother. Then she looked back at the judge. "Someone called my school and said I needed to come to the courthouse. They said I needed to come." "Who called your school?" Another pause. "I don't know. The office lady just said a lawyer called." Calloway looked at Fitch with an expression that communicated multiple things simultaneously, none of them good for Gerald Fitch. "A lawyer called her school," she said, "without parental consent." "Your Honor, the plaintiff—" "I'm going to stop you," Calloway said, "because what I'm about to say needs to be very clear. This court does not permit the testimony of a minor who has been brought to these proceedings without proper legal notification to her parent or guardian. This court also does not look favorably on the tactic of using a child as an instrument of pressure in a civil proceeding, which is what I am observing right now." She looked at the gallery. "Ms. Hayes, you may go to your daughter." Elena released the railing. She crossed the bar. She reached Mara in 4 steps, and she put both hands on her daughter's shoulders, and she looked at her face, really looked, the way you look at someone you love when you've been afraid for them, and you need to verify with your own eyes that they're all right. Mara was pale. There were shadows under her eyes that meant she hadn't slept well last night, which meant she'd known something was happening even before this morning. "I'm okay," Mara said quietly, just for her. "I know," Elena said. "I know you are." She turned Mara gently toward the gallery doors. There was a courthouse aide standing near the back, a young woman who had been present all morning and who now, reading the situation correctly, moved forward to take Mara out. Elena watched her daughter walk through the doors and held herself completely still until the doors closed. Then she turned around. She walked back to the defense table. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at Vincent. He was looking at her. His expression was what it always was. Controlled, measuring, the surface of a man who does not produce what he actually feels in public. But underneath the surface, something had shifted, and it was shifting now in real time. And what Elena saw beneath the control was not what she expected. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't the calculation of a man who had just played a card and was waiting to see the effect. It was something else. Something she had no word for in connection with Vincent Moretti, because she had never seen it on his face before. It was the expression of a man who has just done something that cannot be undone, and who knows it, and who is realizing, in this moment and not before, that it was the wrong thing. He had used his daughter. He had used Mara, arranged for her to be pulled out of school, arranged for her to walk into this courtroom, arranged for the sight of a 12-year-old child to do the work that 3 forged documents had failed to do, which was to make Elena break her composure in front of a judge. And it hadn't worked. And it had cost him something that was separate from legal strategy, something that lived in a different register, something that could not be entered into evidence but would live in every room Vincent Moretti occupied for the rest of his life. He had used his daughter, and it had not worked, and now the room knew what he was. Not the financial records, not the recordings, not the shell companies or the forged signatures or the perjury affidavit. This. "Mr. Fitch," Calloway said, "the court will hear your closing argument on the original motion. You have 5 minutes." Fitch stood. He was a professional. He delivered the 5 minutes with everything he had, which was still considerable. The argument that the asset division agreement had been entered into voluntarily, that the financial records introduced by the defense were incomplete, that the testimony of the witnesses had been selective, that the court should allow additional discovery before making a final determination. He was thorough, and he was skilled, and every word he said was falling into a room that had already made up its mind about what it was looking at. Elena could feel it. Not from Calloway, whose face remained professionally opaque, from the gallery, from the reporters, from the particular quality of attention in the room, which had stopped being the attention of people waiting to see what would happen, and had become the attention of people watching something they already understood reach its inevitable conclusion. When Fitch sat down, Calloway looked at Elena. "Ms. Hayes." Elena stood. She had prepared a closing argument. She had written it out in longhand 3 weeks ago, and revised it twice and memorized the key points in the way you memorize things when you can't afford to forget them. She looked at her notes on the table in front of her, and then she looked up, and she didn't use the notes. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff entered this courtroom this morning with a simple argument that I had agreed to terms and should be held to them. What the evidence has shown is that I agreed to terms without knowing that the full picture of what I was agreeing about had been deliberately hidden from me. That is not a binding agreement. That is the product of fraud." She paused. "The financial records and evidence demonstrate concealment of assets across 3 accounts, with a combined value sufficient to have materially altered any negotiation I might have entered into if I had known they existed. The audio recording demonstrates that the plaintiff was aware of the concealment and planned it deliberately. The testimony of 2 independent witnesses corroborates both the concealment and the plaintiff's direct role in it." Another pause. "The plaintiff's response to this evidence has been to introduce 2 documents bearing my forged signature, to attempt to call a minor child as an unnoticed witness, and to rely on the testimony of a cooperating witness whose own veracity has been compromised by the circumstances of his cooperation agreement." She looked at the judge directly. "This court has everything it needs to rule. The plaintiff has had every opportunity to respond to the evidence with evidence. What he has responded with instead tells you what he does not have." She sat down. The room was quiet. Calloway looked at her notes. She looked at the evidence log. She looked at the document from the state attorney's office still on the corner of her bench. She did these things without speaking for approximately 90 seconds, and in those 90 seconds the room held itself completely still in the way that rooms hold still before something definitive happens. Then she said, "The court rules in favor of the defendant." The gallery broke. It broke loudly and all at once, not in the controlled, professional way that courtroom reactions are supposed to happen, but in the way that human beings react when they have been holding something for a very long time and are suddenly permitted to release it. Reporters were on their phones before Calloway had finished speaking. 2 people in the back row were standing. The sound was not exactly celebration and not exactly relief. It was the sound of compressed pressure releasing, the sound of something that had been under enormous weight finally giving way. Calloway called for order twice. The room came back to something approximating quiet. "The court rules that the asset division agreement of March 14th is void on grounds of fraudulent concealment," she said. "All assets identified in the financial records introduced today are subject to equitable redistribution. The court will appoint a financial examiner to conduct a complete audit of marital assets, including the accounts and evidence, within 30 days. In the interim, All asset transfers made by the plaintiff in the 12 months preceding this proceeding are frozen pending the audit. She looked at both tables. Additionally, given the evidence of potential perjury and document fraud introduced in today's proceeding, the court is referring this matter to the appropriate prosecutorial authorities. Those referrals will be made this afternoon. She looked at Gerald Fitch. Mr. Fitch, your client is advised in the strongest possible terms that any attempt to move, conceal, or otherwise alter the status of the assets identified in today's record will be treated as contempt of this court and will accelerate the criminal referrals accordingly, Fitch said, very quietly. Understood, Your Honor. Calloway looked at the room once more. Then she stood. The clerk called for order. Everyone stood. She walked off the bench. And then the room was in motion, reporters filing out, spectators moving, the courthouse aides beginning the procedural dismantling of the session. And Elena stood at the defense table and did not move through any of it. She stood and she let the motion of the room happen around her, and she breathed steadily, in and out, because breathing was the only thing she was capable of managing in this exact moment. Isabella put a hand on her arm. This time it was actual contact, fingers on her forearm, brief and firm, and then gone. It's done, Isabella said. Not yet, Elena said. She was looking at the plaintiff's table. Vincent had not stood when the judge left. He was still in his chair and Gerald Fitch was beside him, and Gerald was speaking in a low and rapid voice that Elena could not hear across the distance between the tables. As she watched, Vincent put one hand flat on the table. The same gesture she made, she noticed, and the noticing of it produced something strange and uncomfortable in her chest. And he pushed himself to his feet. He straightened his jacket. He straightened his cuffs. He performed, with complete precision, the external maintenance of a man who is in control of himself. And it was the most frightening thing she had seen him do all morning, because all morning he had been losing control in small degrees, and now he had gathered it back, and what lived underneath that regathered control she could not see. He looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at him and said something short. Vincent shook his head once. Then he turned. He walked away from the plaintiff's table, not toward the gallery doors, but toward the side corridor, the same route he'd taken during the recess. His aide fell in beside him. Gerald followed, but at a slight distance, the distance of a man who has professionally done everything he could and is now calculating what comes next in private. At the side corridor door, Vincent stopped. He turned. He looked across the empty distance of the courtroom at Elena. The gallery was nearly empty now. The reporters were gone, or the last of them were moving through the main doors. It was just the two of them and Isabella and the residual courthouse staff, and Vincent stood in the doorway of the side corridor and looked at his estranged wife across the room where his empire had just cracked at the foundation. He said nothing. She said nothing. The look lasted 5 seconds, maybe 6, and in it was 9 years of marriage and 3 years of legal war and the specific accumulated weight of every decision that had led to this room on this morning, and what lived in his face during those 5 or 6 seconds was not something she could name cleanly because it was not one thing. It was layered. It was the look of a man who is genuinely, for the first time in 30 years, uncertain what happens next. Then he turned and walked through the door, and it closed behind him. Elena sat down. She didn't mean to. Her legs made the decision without consulting the rest of her. She sat in the chair at the defense table and put both elbows on the table and pressed her hands against her face, and she stayed that way for, she didn't know how long. Long enough for the room to empty. Long enough for the sound of the courthouse to settle back into its ambient hum. Long enough for the shaking in her arms, which she had not permitted herself to feel all morning, to work its way through and out. Isabella sat beside her and said nothing. That was the right thing. Elena recognized it as the right thing. When Elena took her hands away from her face, her eyes were dry. She had been right about that. She had not cried in this courtroom. She was going to hold that. It mattered to her in a way that she knew was not entirely rational and didn't care. She picked up her phone. She called Donna. It rang twice. "Is it over?" Donna said. "It's over," Elena said. "We won." A sound on the other end of the line that was not quite a word. Then, "Where's Mara?" The courthouse brought her back. "She should be at school by now. Can you pick her up at 3? "Already planned on it." A pause. Elena, are you okay? She thought about how to answer that. I'll tell you tonight, she said. I'll come to dinner. I'll cook something. Don't cook anything elaborate. I'll cook something simple and elaborate, Donna said, which was exactly what Donna always said. And the familiarity of it, the specific and ordinary familiarity of her sister's voice saying exactly what her sister always said, hit Elena somewhere in the chest that she hadn't been protecting, and she felt it there, solid and real, the weight of a normal thing. She ended the call. She was starting to gather her documents when Feldman came through the gallery doors. He moved quickly, with the particular efficiency of a man who has been busy in the last 30 minutes and has more to do. He came to the defense table and looked at both women. Calloway's referrals are going out this afternoon, he said. Our office will coordinate. The asset freeze is in place. He looked at Elena. How are you? Ask me tomorrow, she said. He almost smiled. Fair. He set a card on the table. Someone from our office will contact you in the next 48 hours about the criminal proceeding. You'll need to be available for follow-up. I know. He looked at Isabella. Something in the look was careful and respectful in a way that acknowledged what she had done today without being sentimental about it. Isabella met it evenly. Mrs. Moretti, he said. Thank you. Don't thank me, Isabella said. Just finish it. He nodded. He left. Elena put the card in her bag. She put the last of her documents in on top of it. She picked up the bag and stood, and for a moment she stood at the defense table of Courtroom 14 of the Hargrove County Courthouse, alone in the room except for Isabella, and she looked at the room, the high ceiling, the dark wood, the fluorescent light still flickering in the same place it had been flickering all morning, and she let herself briefly look at it the way you look at something when you know you will not come back to it. She had walked in here at 8:47 that morning with a blue folder and a forged opponent and no attorney and an architecture of truth she had spent 18 months building alone in her kitchen at 2 in the morning. She was walking out with a court ruling, a state attorney's coordination, a financial freeze on every asset Vincent had tried to hide, and a criminal referral that was going out this afternoon. She had walked in alone. She was walking out. She looked at Isabella, who was collecting her own coat and her own small bag with the methodical care of an older woman whose joints have opinions about weather, not quite alone. She walked through the gallery doors. The lobby of the courthouse was busy, in the way that lobbies are busy after something significant. People moving with the particular charged energy of people who have been witnesses to a thing and are now carrying it outward into the world. The reporters already on phones and tablets. The courthouse staff resuming the ordinary traffic of a building that processed many things every day and would continue to process them. Elena moved through it and didn't stop for anyone. She was almost at the main doors when she heard it. Not words. Not a voice she didn't know. A voice she knew exactly. A voice she had known for 9 years, coming from the corridor to the left of the main entrance where the men's room was and where Vincent apparently had not yet left the building. He was on his phone. He wasn't trying to be quiet, or he'd misjudged the acoustics of the marble lobby, which was possible, which would be the first miscalculation of the day that wasn't deliberate. She caught 3 words before his voice dropped. Not finished, and then something she couldn't make out, and then a name. The name was Mara. Elena stopped walking. She stood in the lobby of the courthouse with her bag on her shoulder and her documents in her hands, and she listened to the 3 words she had caught. Not finished. And felt the cold drop again, but lower this time, and harder, and spreading fast. The ruling was done. The assets were frozen. The referrals were going out. She had won the morning, won the proceeding, won in the specific legal sense that the law provided for. She had not won him. Vincent Moretti had stood in the doorway of the side corridor and looked across the courtroom at her for 5 or 6 seconds with something layered and unresolvable in his face. And she had read it as the look of a man confronting the limits of his power. She had been wrong about what she was reading. She had read the layer on top. What was underneath it, what she was hearing now in 3 words that came through a corridor from a man on a phone, was not confrontation with limits. It was recalculation. She moved. She moved fast back toward the corridor, her footsteps on the marble loud enough that she didn't care about them, because she was past the point of managing appearances and into the territory of managing facts. She rounded the corner of the corridor, and Vincent was there, 15 feet away, phone at his ear, his aide 2 paces behind him, Gerald Fitch at his side with a hand already coming up to stop her. "Ms. Hayes," Gerald began. "What did you just say?" she said. She was looking at Vincent. Not at Gerald, at Vincent. "What did you just say on that phone?" Vincent lowered the phone. He looked at her. The recalculated calm was fully in place now. Not the desperate calm of the courtroom recess, but something older and more settled. The calm of a man who has already moved past today and is working on tomorrow. "You should be celebrating," he said. "You won." "What did you say about Mara?" A pause. The aide behind him shifted slightly. Gerald said, "Ms. Hayes, any further communication between the parties should go through—" "I am talking to him," she said, and the way she said it, flat, without elevation, the exact same register Isabella used, made Gerald stop. Vincent looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I told my attorney that regardless of today's ruling, the custody arrangement remains a separate matter, subject to independent review." "Mara has a custody arrangement," Elena said, "established 8 months ago by family court. You have visitation rights that you have exercised 3 times in the past year." "Arrangements change," he said, "not without cause." "Courts determine cause," he said, "not the parties." She looked at him. She was standing 15 feet from him in a courthouse corridor, and she was holding a bag containing 18 months of documentation and a court ruling that had gone entirely in her favor, and the asset freeze was in place, and the criminal referrals were going out, and she had won the morning by every available measure. And he was telling her, without saying it directly, without saying anything that could be recorded or submitted or entered into any record, that he was not done. That today had been one field and he was moving to another. That the thing he had tried to use in the courtroom, Mara, walking down the aisle in her school clothes, had been a preview of the terrain he intended to move into next. She felt the fear. She let herself feel it completely, for exactly 1 breath, because it was real, and it deserved to be acknowledged as real. Then she put it behind her. "Vincent," she said. He looked at her. "I have documentation," she said, of every instance in which you have used your access to Mara as a mechanism of pressure against me. I have records of every school pickup that was late, every scheduled call that didn't happen, every conversation she reported to her therapist in which your name came up in a context her therapist deemed worth documenting." She held his gaze. "I have been documenting Mara's situation with the same consistency I documented the financial records. If you go to family court with a custody modification, I will be ready, the same way I was ready today." He said nothing. "I will always be ready," she said. "That's what today was for. Not to beat you. To show you what I'm capable of when I've had time to prepare." A pause. "Imagine what I've already prepared for the next thing." The corridor was very quiet. Gerald Fitch was looking at the middle distance. The aide was looking at the floor. Vincent was looking at Elena. Then, slowly, something happened in his face that she had never seen there before. Not the involuntary laugh from the courtroom. Something different. Something that took longer to form, and that, when it arrived, had no performance in it whatsoever. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of a man who has had a hard day. The tiredness of a man who has been running a very large and very complex machine for 30 years, and has just understood, for the first time, what it has cost him, and what it is going to cost him, and what it will never give him back. It lasted less than a second. He put the rest of it back in place. He straightened, fractionally. He looked at Gerald. "We're done here," he said. Gerald nodded. He gestured toward the main exit. The aide moved. Vincent moved. They walked past Elena. Vincent close enough that she could hear him breathe, close enough to smell the aftershave she had bought him for his 52nd birthday. And she stood in the corridor and let them pass and did not move. She stood there until their footsteps faded and the lobby sound swallowed them, and there was nothing left of Vincent Moretti in the corridor except the ambient cold of a building in January. Then she walked out. She pushed through the main doors of the Hargrove County Courthouse, and the cold hit her all at once. The full sharp weight of 31 degrees, The same temperature it had been when Vincent had climbed these same steps this morning in his Italian suit with his Swiss watch and his expensive attorneys, and his absolute certainty about how the day was going to go. She stood on the top step. She put her face into the cold air and let it hit her. Below her on the sidewalk, a small cluster of reporters was still present. Cameras, notebooks, phones held out. One of them saw her and said something to the others, and they oriented toward her with the particular collective motion of people pointing themselves at a source. She walked down the steps. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked down every step at the pace of a woman who is done being made to move faster than she wants to move, and she reached the sidewalk and she stopped and she looked at the cameras and she said, clearly and without preparation, "The court ruled in my favor. The assets are frozen. There will be a full audit. I have nothing else to say today." And then she walked past them. She walked to the parking structure 2 blocks from the courthouse where she had left her car that morning. The same car she'd had for 4 years. A gray sedan with a dent in the rear left panel from a parking garage pillar in 2022 that she had never repaired because she hadn't had the money and then had forgotten about. And she unlocked it and she got in and she sat in the cold of the car without starting it. She sat for a while. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again. Then a third time. She looked at the screen. 2 reporters. One number she didn't recognize. She set it face down on the passenger seat. She thought about what Vincent had said in the corridor, not finished. She thought about Mara in her school clothes in the middle of the courtroom aisle, trying to look like she knew what was happening. She thought about the look on Vincent's face in the doorway of the side corridor. The 5 or 6 seconds of something layered and unresolvable, and she thought about what she'd seen underneath it after the recalculation, when he'd been on the phone, when the machine had already moved to its next position. She had told him she was ready for the next thing. She had told him she had documentation. Some of that was true. Not all of it. She was going to have to make the rest of it true, and she was going to have to do it before he did. And she was going to have to do it while simultaneously managing the criminal proceeding coordination with Feldman's office and the 30-day asset audit and whatever Diane Okafor had been trying to reach her about for the past 40 minutes. She saw now, looking at the missed calls, that Diane had called twice during the session and once during the corridor confrontation. She called Diane back. The call connected immediately. "I'm outside, Miss," Diane said. "Parking structure on Millard. A gray sedan." Elena looked around. 2 rows over, she saw a figure in a dark coat standing beside a car with a phone at her ear. She got out. They met in the cold between the parked cars, and Diane Okafor looked at her with the direct and unfussy attention of a woman who has been in serious professional situations and has learned to assess them quickly and without sentiment. "How did it go?" Diane said. "We won the civil proceeding," Elena said. "But he made a phone call outside the courthouse afterward. He used Mara's name." Diane looked at her steadily. "Custody challenge? I think he's going to try."